I am Emma, a 28-year-old woman deeply passionate about antiquity and history, a passion that flows seamlessly into my profession as an antique dealer. My world typically resonates with the quiet symphony of rustling pages and the gentle clinks of ancient artifacts. However, this tranquil existence expanded splendidly when I encountered Alex, a kindred spirit who shared my enthusiasm for relics of the past. Our relationship flourished rapidly, intertwining through shared interests and extensive conversations. One sunny afternoon, Alex, wearing a nervous smile, suggested that it was time for me to meet his family. A flutter of excitement and anxiety stirred within me. I desired to make a lasting impression and reveal to them the woman who had captured their son's heart. The day arrived, and I meticulously selected a vintage blue dress, hoping it would serve as a conversation starter about my love for all things historic. As we drove to his mother's house, Alex reassured me with comforting words. "They're going to love you. Just be yourself." The Harper family home exuded tradition and formality, residing within ancient walls that echoed with a sense of history. Upon introduction, I met Alex's family, including his mother, Mrs. Harper, a woman of commanding presence, and his brothers Ethan and Liam, along with their wives Chloe and Hannah. Dinner unfolded in a room that seemed lifted from a period drama, adorned with family portraits. As we settled in, Mrs. Harper, with a scrutinizing look, directed the conversation toward me. "So, Emma, Alex tells us you're in the antique business. How quaint. What exactly do you do?" Her tone was polite yet edged with an indiscernible quality. Eager to share my passion, I smiled and explained. "I work in a family-owned antique shop. It's fascinating. We help preserve history and find homes for objects that have been part of someone's life." Mrs. Harper let out a loud, somewhat skeptical laugh. Preserving history sounds more like being a glorified junk dealer to me. An awkward silence enveloped the room, punctuated by the slight giggles of Chloe and Hannah. Embarrassment crept up my cheeks, but Alex, sitting beside me, stiffened and defended. "Mom, Emma's work is important. She has a deep knowledge of history and art." Mrs. Harper waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, relax, Alex. I'm just making conversation." The dinner continued with Mrs. Harper often steering the discourse, seemingly ignoring my attempts to engage. I felt like an outsider, struggling to find my place in this unfamiliar world. After dinner, while Alex was in another room, I found myself alone with Chloe and Hannah. "So, Emma, must be interesting surrounded by all that old stuff," Chloe said, her voice tinged with an indiscernible mix of sincerity or sarcasm. "Yes, it's quite fulfilling," I replied, attempting to keep the conversation light. "Every piece has its own story." Hannah smirked, adding, "Well, I suppose someone has to do it. I prefer the modern and new personally." Their thinly veiled condescension lingered, casting a pall over the rest of the evening. That night, as I lay in bed, the echoes of the evening played in my mind. The laughter, the looks, the comments, all pointed to a future where I might never quite fit in. It marked the beginning of an unexpected journey, one that would challenge my love for Alex and test my resolve in ways I never imagined. The day of our wedding was a whirlwind of emotions. Despite the initial discomfort with Alex's family, I clung to the hope that our wedding day would be different, a celebration of our love and union. I chose a classic, elegant gown, hoping to impress Mrs. Harper and just maybe bridge the gap between us. As I walked down the aisle, my heart fluttered not just with nerves about the lifelong commitment, but also with the uncertainty of fitting into Alex's family. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with laughter and tears. However, it was the reception that brought my anxieties to the forefront. As Alex and I mingled with guests, I noticed Mrs. Harper huddled with Chloe and Hannah, their heads close together in whispered conversation. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, I focused on the joyous occasion. Later, as we sat at the head table, Mrs. Harper raised her glass for a toast. "To Alex and Emma, may your life be as beautiful and unique as the antiques you cherish." The crowd laughed warmly, and I forced a smile. Yet Mrs. Harper's eyes held a glimmer of something else. After the toast, she leaned over to me, her voice low but clear. You do look lovely, Emma, though I must say, Cologne and Hannah's dresses at their weddings were quite the talk of the town, unique, just like them. My smile faltered, her words stinging more than I cared to admit. Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I'm glad you think I look nice today, I replied, and she nodded, her eyes scanning the room. Of course, dear. It's important to keep up appearances, isn't it, especially in a family like ours? The rest of the evening, I couldn't shake her words. They lingered in my mind, a reminder that I was being constantly compared and evaluated. As the night drew to a close and guests started to leave, Alex noticed my subdued mood. What's wrong, Emma? You seem a bit off, he asked. I hesitated, not wanting to spoil our special day. It's nothing, just tired, I guess. I reassured Alex as he wrapped his arm around me. It's been a long day, but a wonderful one. Don't let anything spoil it, okay? I nodded, attempting to push Mrs. Harper's comments to the back of my mind. However, deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a series of comparisons and subtle jabs. Life as Alex's wife was becoming increasingly challenging, especially with his mother, Mrs. Harper. She had a way of making me feel small and insignificant, a feeling that grew with every passing week. The most challenging part was the unannounced visits she started making to our apartment. One afternoon, while I was sorting through antique jewelry for the shop, the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I found Mrs. Harper standing there, an uninvited guest with a knack for finding faults. Emma dear, I thought I'd drop by. I was in the neighborhood, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. As she walked around our living room, her eyes scanned every corner, every piece of furniture. You know, cleanliness is next to godliness, she remarked, running her finger along the mantelpiece and inspecting it for dust. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. I do my best to keep the house clean, Mrs. Harper, I said softly. It's just that Chloe and Hannah, they keep their homes immaculate. Perhaps you could learn a thing or two from them. Her words stung, and I struggled to maintain my composure. I'll keep that in mind, I managed to say, though her constant comparisons were wearing me down. Alex walked in just then, and his face lit up seeing his mother. Mom, what a pleasant surprise. Mrs. Harper smiled at him, the picture of affection. Just checking in on you two, making sure you're living comfortably. I watched as Alex chatted with her, completely oblivious to the tension in the room. After a while, Mrs. Harper left, but her presence lingered like a dark cloud. Later that evening, I decided to talk to Alex about it. Alex, your mother's visits and comments are really getting to me. It feels like she's always judging me, comparing me to Chloe and Hannah. Alex looked surprised. Really? I thought she was just being her usual self. She means well, Emma. His dismissive response frustrated me. It's not just harmless, Alex. It's constant criticism. It makes me feel like I'm not good enough. He sighed, a look of confusion on his face. I guess I've never noticed it. That's just how Mom is. She criticizes everyone. Don't take it personally. The unannounced visits continued, each one leaving me feeling more drained than the last. My confidence began to wane, and I found myself questioning my worth, my abilities, even my marriage. One particular visit from Mrs. Harper left me reeling. She had walked into our kitchen, inspecting it with a critical eye. Oh, Emma, these countertops are a mess. And look at this. Are these last night's dishes? I always taught my boys to marry women who could keep a tidy home. Her words cut deep, and I struggled to find a response. I've been busy with work, Mrs. Harper. I haven't had a chance to clean up yet. She shook her head, her expression one of disappointment. You should manage your time better, dear. A clean home is a happy home after all. As she left, I felt a sense of defeat wash over me. It seemed no matter what I did, it would never be enough for Mrs. Harper. And with Alex's indifference to the situation, I felt increasingly isolated and misunderstood. The festive season, meant to be a time of joy and celebration, was tinged with anxiety. Mrs. Harper's announcement that we would all be celebrating Christmas at her house with specific instructions for each daughter-in-law to bring a dish, filled me with dread. A few days before Christmas, Alex, ever eager to please his mother, had his own expectations. "Emma, you should make your beef Wellington. It's always a hit." "We need to impress Mom this year," he said, his tone hinting at the importance he placed on his mother's opinion. I nodded, feeling the pressure. "Sure, I'll do my best." On Christmas Day, I carefully prepared the dish, putting extra effort into ensuring it was perfect. Arriving at Mrs. Harper's house, the atmosphere was festive, with decorations adorning every corner. Chloe and Hannah had already arrived, their dishes on display. As dinner commenced, Mrs. Harper began her ritual of tasting and commenting on each dish. "Chloe, this casserole is delightful, just like the one you made last year. And Hannah, this salad is so fresh and vibrant. You always know how to bring a healthy option to the table." Both Chloe and Hannah beamed under her praise, while I nervously awaited my turn. Finally, Mrs. Harper reached for a slice of my beef Wellington. The room fell silent as she chewed thoughtfully, then made a face, pushing the plate away. "This is bland, completely tasteless. Honestly, Emma, if you can't cook, you shouldn't bother trying." The room erupted in quiet giggles from Chloe and Hannah. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and hurt. Alex, seated next to me, said nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate. I tried to defend myself. "I'm sorry you didn't like it, Mrs. Harper. I followed the recipe exactly." Mrs. Harper waved her hand dismissively. "Well, next time leave the cooking to those who know how. This dish is more suited for the trash." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I felt small and humiliated, my confidence shattered. Alex's lack of support only added to my sense of isolation. Later that night, back at our apartment, I confronted Alex. "Why didn't you say anything when your mother insulted my cooking?" "You saw how upset I was," I said, my voice rising with emotion. Alex sighed, a look of frustration crossing his face. "Emma, that's just how Mom is. She doesn't mean any harm." "You're taking this too seriously," he replied, his tone a mix of indifference and annoyance. "You need to learn to let these things go. It's not worth getting upset over." But it was worth it to me. It was about respect, about being valued and supported, especially by the person who was supposed to be my partner. The tension that had been building up over the past few months seemed to culminate as Mrs. Harper's birthday approached. Alex, ever keen to stay in his mother's good graces, insisted that we needed to outdo his brothers with our gift. "Emma, this is important to Mom. We need to give her something that stands out, something that shows we care more," Alex said one evening as we discussed gift ideas. Reluctantly, I suggested an antique vase from our shop. It was exquisite with a rich history that I thought would appeal to Mrs. Harper's taste. "It's beautiful and unique, just like her," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Alex scrutinized the vase, his expression uncertain. "All right, but remember how Mom reacts on you." His words stung, but I brushed them aside, hoping the vase would somehow bridge the gap between Mrs. Harper and me. On the day of the birthday celebration, we arrived at Mrs. Harper's house, the vase carefully wrapped. The atmosphere was lively, with family members exchanging pleasantries. Chloe and Hannah had already presented their gifts, both receiving warm approval from Mrs. Harper. Finally, it was our turn. I unwrapped the vase, presenting it to Mrs. Harper with a hopeful smile. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Harper. We thought this would be a perfect addition to your collection." Mrs. Harper's expression changed from anticipation to disbelief as she examined the vase. "This? You think this old piece of glass is a suitable gift?" Her voice was laced with contempt. I felt my heart sink. "It's an antique, Mrs. Harper. It has a lot of historical value." I began, but before I could say more, Mrs. Harper's anger boiled over. With a look of disgust, she hurled the vase to the ground, shattering it into countless pieces. "I don't want this junk in my house. This is an insult." The room fell silent. I stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. Alex, who had been standing next to me, turned and said in a low voice, "You should leave, Emma. You've upset my mother enough." His words were like a final blow, stripping away any remaining hope I had of fitting into his family. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the house, the sound of the shattered vase echoing in my ears. Back at our apartment, I packed a few essentials, my mind racing with the events of the evening. I left the divorce papers on the kitchen table, a silent message to Alex that I could no longer endure this life. Later, when Alex called, his tone was incredulous. "Emma, you can't be serious. This is just a misunderstanding." But my decision was firm. "No, Alex, it's not a misunderstanding. It's the reality of how your family treats me and how you let them. I can't live like this." Leaving Alex and the life I had tried to build with him was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. But after the debacle at Mrs. Harper's birthday, I knew it was the only choice I had if I wanted to preserve my dignity and self-worth. I hadn't even finished unpacking in my new apartment when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Harper. "Emma, you never were a good match for my Alex. Just a junk dealer with no taste and no respect for your elders." I felt my heart sink as soon as I answered. I held the phone away from my ear, her harsh words echoing in my quiet living room. "Mrs. Harper, I think it's best if we don't speak to each other." I tried to keep my voice calm. She scoffed. "You could have learned a thing or two from Chloe and Hannah. They are the ideal wives for my sons. They understand family values." I hung up the phone, her words leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. The call was a painful reminder of why leaving was the right decision. However, what I didn't expect was running into Chloe and Hannah just a few days later at a local coffee shop. "Oh, look, it's Emma. How's the junk business?" Chloe taunted as they approached my table. Hannah chimed in with a sly smile. "We heard about the divorce, you know. You just had to play the game, make Mrs. Harper happy, laugh at her jokes. It's not that hard." Their words stung, but I was no longer the woman who would take this silently. I'm not like you two. I don't giggle and fawn over someone for personal gain. I have my integrity. Chloe laughed mockingly. "Integrity won't get you a nice inheritance." Hannah nodded in agreement. "Exactly. It's all about playing smart, Emma. You just didn't get it." I looked at them, two women who had surrendered their self-respect for material gains. Enjoy your gain, then. I prefer to live a life where I don't have to lose myself for someone else's wealth. I left the coffee shop with a newfound sense of clarity. Their candid admission was shocking but not surprising. It reaffirmed my belief that I had made the right decision. Though the road ahead was uncertain and possibly challenging, I knew that I had chosen a path that upheld my values and respect for myself. Months had passed since I left Alex, and life had settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. I was at my antique shop, engrossed in restoring a vintage clock, when I overheard a couple of regular customers gossiping. "Poor Mrs. Harper, all alone with her health failing. None of her family wants anything to do with her," one said. "Yes, I heard she's been complaining that her sons and their wives have abandoned her," added the other. Their words stirred a mix of emotions in me, but pity wasn't one of them. The next day, as I was sifting through some old letters in the shop, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mrs. Harper's number. Taking a deep breath, I answered. "Emma, it's me, Mrs. Harper. I'm ill, very ill. No one is here to help me, not even my own sons." Her voice was weak, quivering with a blend of desperation and self-pity. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Harper. But why are you calling me?" "I'm no longer part of your family," I replied, my tone neutral. "But you were once. You're the only one I can turn to now. My sons, their wives, they don't care. They insult me, ignore me," she said, her voice cracking. I couldn't help but let out a short laugh. "Mrs. Harper, do you remember how you treated me, how you insulted and belittled me at every turn?" There was a pause on the other end, and then she said, "But I'm family. You have a duty to help me." "No, Mrs. Harper, I had a duty to your son, which ended when our marriage did," I responded, my patience wearing thin. "And let's not forget the antique vase you smashed at your birthday. That vase was worth thousands that you owe me," I added firmly. There was a sharp intake of breath from her end. $5,000. "I don't have that kind of money." That's not my problem, Mrs. Harper. You should have thought about that before you destroyed it, I replied. The call ended shortly after, with Mrs. Harper's pleas turning into bitter mumbles. I hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Mrs. Harper was reaping the consequences of her actions, alienated by her own family due to her harsh and critical nature. Life after my divorce from Alex had settled into a peaceful routine centered around the antique shop, which had become my sanctuary. I was content in my little world of timeless treasures until one autumn day brought an unexpected twist. While enjoying a quiet cup of coffee at a local cafe, I overheard a conversation between two patrons. Poor Mrs. Harper, one said, her own children sent her to a nursing home against her will. Can you imagine? The irony of Mrs. Harper's situation wasn't lost on me. The woman who once wielded control over her family, with sharp words and criticisms, was now at the mercy of their decisions. A few days later, fate played its hand as I walked down a bustling street, lost in thought about an upcoming auction. I bumped into someone. It was Alex, his face twisted into a look of contempt upon seeing me. "Emma, the ungrateful," he sneered, quietly yet with venom in his voice. Taken aback by his bitterness but not intimidated, I responded, "Ungrateful. That's a bit rich coming from you, Alex." "What's that supposed to mean?" he retorted, his voice rising. Realizing we were attracting attention, I decided it was time to set the record straight. "Well, considering you and your brothers put your mother in a nursing home, refusing to care for her, you're hardly one to talk about gratitude." His face flushed with anger and embarrassment as passers-by began to take notice. "That was a family decision. You have no right to judge," he shot back. "I have every right when you call me ungrateful," I shot back. "Seems to me like you abandoned the woman who needed you most. Where's your gratitude and respect for her?" Alex's expression faltered, a mix of shame and anger. He glanced around, noticing the curious and disapproving looks from the people around us. Without another word, he turned on his heel and hurried away, leaving me standing there, a mixture of relief and triumph washing over me. I continued my walk, the encounter leaving me with a sense of closure. The final chapter with Alex and his family had ended not with a whimper, but with a revelation of their true colors. Later, as I sat in my cozy apartment surrounded by relics of the past, I reflected on how much I had grown. The Emma who once sought approval and acceptance from Alex and his family was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who stood her ground, and who no longer tolerated disrespect.